Well, today we commemorate International Women's Day, a day which brings attention to gender equality. This year's theme is that of breaking the bias. Dr. Laura Fisher, Head of Institutional Advancement at Boston City Campus, joins us for more on this. Welcome to you, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here this afternoon.
Now, Dr. Fisher, as we begin to unpack the significance of commemorating this day, International Women's Day, year in and year out, the question persists. How significant have the advances been for women over the years, given that there's still so much work to be done, especially in this African continent, from so many vantage points, especially when we start to talk about equity, gender equality in leadership positions. What for you are the key areas that still are lagging and need urgent attention?
I think it's a very broad, big and broad question that you're asking me. And I know that we don't have a lot of time. But I think one of the key areas, obviously coming from an educational perspective, is to really be addressing the issues of gender parity in education and the need for us to be closing the gap in access to education for women in particular in occupations where there is occupational demand and critical scarce skills, and where there is a gap between pay and also the number of women in particular industries.
Now, if we start to then, take that question and slice it up into little parts, if we start to look at gender equality in leadership positions, whether it's in education or other fronts, how are we doing? And especially South Africa, how do you think that's faring?
I think that we've made tremendous headway. I think we've been innovative, and I think the one thing about celebrating International Women's Day is that we get to celebrate the strength, the beauty, the resilience, the dynamism of women in our country, and that despite the odds, they have been able to progress, and we as a country have progressed. But when we reflect on what we've just heard just a few minutes ago, when women cannot even sleep with both of their eyes closed because they're so scared of the violence around them, I think it's even difficult to speak about how we take steps forward in these particular areas, such as education, leadership, management. However, with that said, I think that we are making headway in moving women from, out of just traditional family settings where they're expected just to be the ones in the communities raising children, really to taking huge steps forward in terms of gaining access to education and really rising up in education, and actually in some ways outshining men. For example, within our context, in some of our programs at Boston City Campus, we have higher graduation rates of females in accounting, for example, than we do males. So we're outshining in some areas. And so there is great strides being made. And then that does translate into management and leadership, and ultimately will translate into us slowly making the headway towards us gaining gender parity like we really are wishing to see, and closing the gender gap. But the gender gap and the gap itself remains a greater challenge than ever before. And I think COVID set us back, has set us back tremendously. So despite the unprecedented advances we've made in sending robots to explore the surface of Mars, or creating a vaccine to pretty much end a pandemic, or at least to make it more endemic, we still are very far away from achieving full gender equality here in South Africa. But in the reality, that is a global issue still.
I mean, I was going to say that you take a very optimistic view on this day and in terms of the advances of women. And again, it becomes very tricky when you have to balance those advances with some of the fundamental challenges that we are seeing. But I'm glad that you've mentioned, that gender gap that still persists today. And a lot of women are trying, to close that gap. Well, the day comes ahead of next week's Commission on the Status of Women. This is the largest UN gathering dedicated to women's rights. How significant do you think it is that South Africa, is chairing this particular event for the next 2 years, particularly if we start to look at some of the gaps that this country is facing?
I think it's phenomenally significant. And I think that it is precisely because we as South African women are able to, despite the odds, often take a view of optimism because of our inherent innate resilience, that we get to do things such as you've just mentioned. So in discussing and in looking at the evolution of gender-based gaps among 4 key dimensions: economic participation, opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment, I think to have us chairing and discussing these critical issues and looking at how we've tracked and the progress we've made, or maybe have not made, but the strides that we will endeavor to make into the future. I think that despite the fact that we face some really moments where we have to say, what are we doing? Why do we still have a stagnant median gender pay gap of between 23 to 35%? But although we face these struggles, we're still willing to step up and say, we will be the forerunners, we will be the leaders. And I think that is what we are wanting to see when we personally, as a higher educational institution, such as Boston City Campus, say to women, come and actually be proactive, be trained, be empowered, and become voices for change for women in this country. So I think it's really significant that we are doing such a task as this. And I think that it stands us in such incredible stead. I think we are forerunners and global leaders in so many areas, and the world does look to us. And I think this is just another example where South Africa gets to stand up and really shine a light and really lead the path toward change, towards the change we want to see in the future. And, we need action to level the playing field. And there's no greater way to take action than to take leadership. So that's exactly what we're doing here.
Dr. Laura, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I really do hope that South Africa advancing, the cause, as you say, will definitely speak volumes for women in South Africa who still find themselves in the back foot. But thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Dr. Laura Fisher, Head of Institutional Advancement at Boston City Campus.